Hello, welcome to my parental alienation journey, focusing on what I can control and living my best life. My name is Glenn Solers. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode, which is a special episode as I have an acquaintance on the line with me today doing an interview on parental alienation, and she is a licensed therapist and has done a lot of research on parental alienation. And I've learned a lot from her in this interview, as I'm sure you will as well, in terms of what it is, what to watch out for, what to do. So please enjoy yourself on this interview and journey with Shannon. I'm so honored and blessed to have an old acquaintance of mine, Shannon, here on the show today to talk a bit about parental alienation. She and I spoke years ago just about family situations and dynamics, and I was always enlightened by her stories and what she shared. And I decided to reach out to Shannon because of situations that I'm going through with my child and around parental alienation. And Shannon is a licensed therapist, owns her own practice, and she also specializes in psychotherapy. And I called her and I was so amazed when she responded because it's been so long that I've seen Shannon. And Shannon, thank you for coming onto the show today, talking a bit about parental alienation. And maybe you can just introduce yourself and share a bit more about you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much, Glenn. It was so nice to hear from you and to have you reach out. I'm no longer in the new state, but I really miss being on the island and in the neighborhood and in the area. But I'm still in BC, so I'm over on the like we're in the on the coast on the other side there. So it's northern BC, so it's different, but it's really nice to hear from you. And as you mentioned, yep, I am now a licensed clinical professional. I'm a member of the Canadian Psychological Association, Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association, and I do practice psychotherapy and provide counseling and therapy to clients. I work with individuals and couples and families, and I really am passionate about what I do. I was just admitted to a doctoral program in the US where I'll be working on my PhD in clinical psychology. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here and talking about the topic of parental alienation. I'm not a specialist in that area, but when I heard from you and thought that we were going to focus on this topic, I did quite a bit of research on it, looked at all the most up-to-date, evidence-based stuff in the field, and also from my own clinical experience and working with
Yeah.
individuals and people that are in these situations. So,
Well, I
yeah,
didn't mean this to be extra work for you, Shannon.
not at all.
So I
I'm
appreciate you
kind of
doing all the
kind of
research.
passionate about this kind of thing, right? So, like,
Well, you've always come
yeah,
across as a people-oriented person, and obviously
yeah,
you have a big family as well that you work
yeah,
with, and you come from
yeah,
a human resources background, so you're used to dealing with
yeah,
people, and it's so nice to see
absolutely.
you actually getting into this field because,
Yeah,
yeah, it's so important to build stronger communities, stronger family connections, and help people deal with mental health. And I think sometimes people forget about the importance of mental health and they focus on their physical side, but really wherever, like where our brain is, that's kind of where we go. So
yeah.
thanks for this journey that we're going to go on today, talking a bit about parental alienation. The first question I have for you, Shannon, is why do you think people alienate their children in the first place?
Yeah, and that is a big question. It's especially when it's a parent that's in that situation and is the alienated parent. Why would someone do that, right? It's confusing. So there's a lot of reasons. I think it can come to, personality and temperament, environmental factors, sometimes it's social factors and that person's upbringing. In the research, I've seen that there are quite a bit of people with cluster B personality characteristics. So that's like borderline personality, narcissistic personality. Those types of personalities tend to be more prone to being an alienating parent. There's that emotional instability and sort of black and white kind of thinking, which can sort of precipitate that kind of behavior when it's happening. During divorce, parents can feel very heightened on both sides, like both parents. So it can get stressful, confusing for both. So I think what happens is they can use their own children as a mechanism to sort of precipitate that response in a way. They may use their children as a way to fulfill their own personal wants and needs. in that situation. They can feel threatened by the child's relationship with that parent, the other parent,
Hmm.
um, and they may feel that that relationship is like a threat to their own relationship with the child in a way.
I see. And just a quick question to follow up on that, because you
Yeah.
mentioned just their early experiences. So just to give a bit about my personal experience, my ex-wife,
Mm.
when she was young, her father up and left the entire family without any rationale. So
Right.
I think she was probably 2 or 3, so she knew a bit about her father, but just up and left. What kind of impact does it have on a child if like a family member, such as a father or mother, leaves, in terms
Yes.
of the
Mm.
mental impact on them? Because I
Yeah.
can imagine for her, it's she was used to not having a father, but it must have made her feel a certain way as well when she was younger, around all of a sudden just having her sister and her mother there, and that's it. And the
Yeah,
father's gone.
absolutely. Yeah, that's quite traumatic. That's traumatic. And you have to look at the age of the child too when something like that happens, right? Like they're the stage of development that they're at. They may not have the capacity to really understand that and what's happening. In a lot of ways, children can blame themselves and they hold on to that. So it's quite traumatic.
And
And
how
it,
could that manifest itself later on in life?
that fear of abandonment, that
Okay.
sort of deficit in interpersonal relationships and being able to be empathetic and understanding, and it can have a lasting impact for sure, on relationships, you know, down the road, friendships, workplace relationships. Like it can absolutely have that lasting effect for sure. And it
Okay.
can start to manifest in one's own relationship with a partner, so like a primary attachment to a spouse is where it maybe will really start to present.
What do you mean by that?
So when we have these primary attachments to like a parent, they begin to be replaced by a spouse, right? So it's like a hierarchy. So you have, mom and dad, and then when you grow up, you have a partner, a new partner, a spouse, or someone that you've married, and that takes that place. But some almost like the script that was there with those primary parents resurfaces with your new spouse, and it's so those same behaviors and that attachment takes place of the experience with the parents early on. So like those same fears and things may start to resurface, and unless it's been worked on, unless
I
it's,
see.
you know what I mean? So yeah, it's almost like it feels the same. So
Okay.
it usually turns up in an insecure attachment style. So I don't know if you've ever heard of like attachment styles, but there's two
No.
types. There's
Okay.
secure and there's insecure. And when there's these insecure attachment styles, they show up as being either anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. And usually with those cluster B personality styles, you're going to have a disorganized, fearful attachment style. So, and unhealthy. It feels unhealthy for the other spouse for sure. Yeah. And toxic.
Okay. And thanks for
Yeah, so
clarifying
there's
that,
a
because
whole other
yeah,
kind of words, right?
for my experience, and I can only speak about my experience. My ex-wife, I was very fearful of her. She was very jealous when we first met, and
Yeah.
she was very possessive of me. And we lost a lot of friends because she would start canceling people if she
Oh yeah.
suspected things were not right or things didn't go her way. So I lost a lot of friends. She lost a lot of friends because it was more, she created this cancel culture. So would that be kind of
Okay.
part of this then?
Absolutely. That would be some of those behaviors probably manifesting, yeah, within your relationship. Yeah.
Okay. When it comes to like the child experience when they're going through parental alienation,
Mm.
what is the emotional impact on them possibly?
Yeah. So, I mean, it can be, I think it really depends on the child, right? Because there are some temperaments where it may not affect the child so much, especially if they have other supports. But as I mentioned before, when a child is in that early development stage, especially when it's before 6 years old, it has an incredible impact on their stress response system, right? So most separations, when a child is involved, when they go through a divorce or something with the family, it's an adverse experience. So it's called an ACE, right? So an adverse childhood experience. So that's trauma. That's a
Okay.
traumatic experience for the child, and it absolutely has a lasting impact on them and their relationships going forward. and experiences going forward, right? That toxic stress can, show up in ways like withdrawal or fear of abandonment or OCD behaviors, or maybe they develop an eating disorder. Maybe it shows up in childhood anxiety or depression, or, in all sorts of ways. It may start to really come up when they, reach adulthood and they're starting to struggle with their own interpersonal relationships.
And when you say struggle, like what kind of struggles would they maybe face when they're an adult?
Mhm. There might be that fear of attachment, or maybe I don't know, like the observations that they had in their own relationship with their parents might be enough to have them fear getting close to someone else. You know, I was reading a little bit about that. Let me just, I have the research right in front of me. If you don't mind, I could
Yeah, no, no
probably
worries. Yeah, thank
kind
you.
of share it. I like to always look at the research and what they say on that. Yeah, like, children's appraisals of conflict, right? And their own parenting quality or their own self-worth.
Hmm.
That's all affected, as they go through life. In this one study, they were looking at developmental psychology, and the interparental conflict with children. And yeah, so it affects their own emotional security.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting like when because I teach conflict resolution as one of the courses that I
Yeah.
do. And one thing that we talk about is how we learn how to deal with problems from our parents.
Yeah,
We've
absolutely.
seen them I
Yeah.
communicate or not communicate. So my dad was an alcoholic, and what I saw was I never knew what was going to happen. So I grew up with a lot of insecurities and anxiety around that because I didn't know what was going to come home at night when my dad came home, and there was alcohol
Yeah.
abuse, and then my mother was the victim there. We're all the victim in the home. But so when I deal with conflict now, I get very nervous around conflict, especially when it comes to family matters. At work, it's not such a big deal, but with family matters, I find I struggle with it. And so when I'm thinking about like an alienated child, they will see, okay, I don't know, and maybe I'm wrong here, Shannon, but if you don't see two parents able to work out problems and figure things out and you just leave one parent, what is that child learning about problem solving or conflict?
Right. Absolutely. So they haven't learned that they haven't learned mediating or negotiation skills. They
Mhm.
haven't they're not learning that in a healthy way.
Why do children tend to side with one parent and ignore the other in these cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So that what comes to mind with that is, loyalty, right? That showed up in the research. So when a child is with the primary parent and there's this lack of ambivalence, that makes it very confusing for the child, right?
Hmm.
That primary parent, which is the alienating parent, has sort of these fictional themes and like fictional allegations that they're continuing to talk about and that the child is continuing to hear. It's almost like a form of brainwashing, right? And as a child who really doesn't have the power to stand up to that, they almost feel fearful to the point where they have to side with that parent because they would face that against them, and they need to survive.
Okay.
They need to rely on that parent to eat and to be housed and to be safe. And so they really have no other choice. I was reading some research where someone specializes in working with families and like family systems in, with alienating parents. And there's actually this syndrome that they've come up with that was identified in 1985 called parental alienation syndrome. There's not enough evidence to classify it as like a diagnosis in like our diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, but it shows up enough. Like I think in something like 50% of US divorces, there is this type of behavior happening where there's like a parent that's alienating their children. And it like, yeah, it's absolutely, it's abusive to put a child in that position where even though they know that they may have had a healthy relationship with the other parent before the separation or divorce, but when they go through this, it's just so confusing that they have no choice. Like and there's this discourse too in the legal field where even though the child isn't put in a position where they can express their feelings or their thoughts or their interpretation because it just gets overrode with this legal discourse where they were just a small child. Like they wouldn't be able to stand up to that. So they really have no choice but to shut down who they are and what their experience is with the other parent in order to stay safe.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
You
Hmm.
just said something that just blew my mind because my
Yeah.
son has a podcast now that he does, and I made the mistake of listening to it, Shannon.
Oh no.
And
Yeah.
I've done it a few times.
Yeah.
And he expresses in his podcast that he believes that I never loved him, that I was gaslighting him, that he has no want to mend the relationship. But what he also shared in the podcast was he would never talk to his mom about anything.
Right.
He doesn't want to
Exactly.
express his feelings to her and can't have a conversation. Like they were talking about Mother's Day in one of the podcasts and how he feels so uncomfortable sharing anything close with his mother for whatever reason. And so that kind of tied into what you just mentioned to me. I don't know if
Yeah.
that is related at all around.
Absolutely. I mean, and I don't know your son and his
Yeah.
mother and what that would feel like for him, but when you are, when I see it a lot in my clinical experience with my clients when they have a mother that is narcissistic or has these narcissistic personality traits or even borderline traits, you don't get to be you. You either say something that mother or that parent agrees with, or you face confrontation and conflict and put downs and the whole and it's just not safe to express that. So they adapt and they learn how to survive with that parent. Yeah.
You don't get to be you.
No, you don't get
Wow.
to be you. You get
So
what
you
happens is you develop these protective parts, right? In my work with clients, I use internal family systems theory a lot. So that's where we don't have one sort of mono part of ourselves. We have all these sort of different, we have a Glenn that goes to work or a Glenn that's at home relaxing, and we have these different parts of ourselves, right? So when we're going through these adverse experiences in childhood, we develop these protective parts. And it's almost like a part of us that that helps us in this situation that we adapt to, that helps us to be safe and to say the right things and to do the right behaviors and to just kind of survive, really. So we don't really get to know who our true core self is. We're all born with this true core self, but when we're living in a sort of a survival mode like that, we have this part that's protecting us, that's not letting us touch on that sort of exiled part of ourselves, that wound, right? So I can imagine that it must be not really your son, it's that part of him that's protecting him right now.
yeah, and
Mm.
for me, I like when I'm not being authentic with people, I notice anxiety goes up. I
Yeah,
get nervous, right? And he mentioned
absolutely. Yeah,
in the same podcast that his anxiety rates are actually going up.
yeah,
And just like what you said, it's no, and I'm just speculating here. It could be no wonder that it's happening if he's losing himself through this whole process. Of course your anxiety would go up.
yeah,
It's not,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I mean, like when you're around that kind of behavior with a parent that's doing the alienating, like I can't even imagine. Like some of the stuff I read in the research is just like, it's hostile, it's bitter, it's angry. And when you're a child that's hearing that and you're
Mm.
around that in your upbringing, it's going to create fear and anxiety and depression and all sorts of symptoms. It doesn't feel good. Yeah.
There's this one podcast I started listening to. Well, she actually has a YouTube channel. I always call it a podcast, but it's not really a podcast. And she is a recovered alienated child, and she's now 30, had kids of her own, and then she started
Yeah.
realizing that she lost her father, and but now they have a good relationship, and now she's canceled out her mother. I was just about to ask Shannon a question. I completely forgot what that question was, and it was so important. It'll probably pop back into my mind. I'm not sure when. I'll blame it on my age for now, Shannon.
Okay.
So we started getting into losing your authentic self,
Yeah.
and you become somebody who you're not. It can increase your anxiety rates. What are
Yeah.
some other long-term mental health implications? Now, I know as an alienated father, I know for me, I've struggled. There was a moment in my time, like this was a number of years ago, where I
Yeah.
felt I couldn't even be present with people because
Yeah.
I felt like part of me was missing, and I had to,
Yeah.
because I lost my identity as a father. The other part was I was getting dizzy sometimes. Like I'd walk through a mall or go to the Home Depot or whatever, and I'd start noticing that I'm getting a bit dizzy. And now I've made it through that. However, I know some alienated parents actually commit suicide because it's too tough to handle. So self-awareness work is so critical around understanding more about this and working on oneself, trying to be the best self. But in
Yeah.
terms of a child who doesn't necessarily know how to do self-awareness work or is not
Right. Yeah, they're not
as
there
connected
yet.
to that, what are some of the short-term and long-term mental health impacts on
Mhm.
children who have gone through alienation?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that, and I was looking in the research about that, and it kind of in this one study I was reading, they talked about how the conflict can impair the child's, makes them more vulnerable, to conflict and behavioral and cognitive problems later on, and it affects their development in that way.
Hmm.
Uh, there's, I was reading that they may be more susceptible to anxiety disorders and depression symptoms and fear. Like I had mentioned, this fear of attachment and a fear of, abandonment, and it really sort of skews them off of that developmental path.
Hmm.
When we have experienced this sort of chronic stress, right? Because that's stressful, that's traumatic for a child. And they talk about, I actually wanted to mention this. I'm going to see if I can find that in here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to edit that out, but there was something in here that I thought would be important to share.
Sure, yeah.
So it has to do with screening, right? So when that is one of the things that I wanted to get to about how to sort of be more aware of this when this is happening, when parents are, separating and divorcing, and how to get more on top of this to sort of prevent this, because it is a syndrome, like I said, parental alienation syndrome, and it's quite common and
Well,
it's just not. But what
a
they
question,
talk,
sorry, but sorry, Shannon,
yeah.
to interrupt. A question about that though, because they're now they've dropped the name syndrome off parental alienation
Mm.
because they're saying it's not a syndrome. Some people even
Yeah.
deny the fact that this even
Oh,
exists.
absolutely. And I
Yeah,
read that too, the
yeah,
conflict
right.
of
It's like,
it.
and then you hear from
Yeah.
people like this Maddie person, for sure it
Yeah.
exists. Like
Yeah.
she experienced it and she's living it. And there's so many others that have experienced
Yeah.
this. Um, but yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I was reading. So I found in the research, there's this one study here, and they talk about how excessive tenacious stressors during childhood can result in acute and long-term behavioral and emotional challenges, right? So poor school performance or high-risk behaviors you might start seeing in a child, or physical illness and vast psychological pathologies, right? So like I talked about with anxiety disorder and depression, and that it might there's, when you're talking about mental health, it's a continuum, because we're not always feeling perfectly good and happy every day. Like, it's, some people might experience something and they get more skewed towards anxiety or more skewed towards depression, and then we get some support and we move back to feeling good and happy. But with something like this and this long-term stress for a child, it may push them to being more towards a disorder like anxiety or depression type of thing. When this thing happens, especially in the first 6 years of life, it can be detrimental to the child's well-being, right? It can be huge, have a huge impact to them later on
Mhm.
in life.
And do you think
Yeah.
this also ties into history repeats itself? Like I've read some stuff that some kids that have alienated their parents, eventually they become alienated from their kids.
I do, like, I from my own clinical experience, like I said, and using these approaches that I use with trauma, it's called reenactment. So
Okay.
it's, in a way, we hurt those in the ways that we've been hurt, in a way.
Hmm.
And it's kind of part of our own life journey where we start to experience what was done to us, where we kind of start to find ourselves continuing to be in those same situations until we stop that cycle by doing our own work. And it sounds like
Yeah.
you shared that you've done your own work from your own life experiences, where you've kind of stopped, you've gotten in the way of that legacy, where you're going to stop that from continuing. It's called reenactment, where that continues to happen from
Mm.
generation to generation to generation. And the
Yeah.
term would be like intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I started a bit too late.
There's never too late.
It's never.
It's never too late. It's never too late to change and shift those, to just notice that, and not to have to hold on to that. You know, one day he may say, this wasn't my stuff. This was my mom. And and
Yeah.
and detach from that, you know.
And I guess the hard thing is a lot of people don't want to do the work, or they're not even aware that that they're doing
Exactly.
it until you actually take a step back and see, well, what am I doing to contribute to this?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what do you say to people that just say this thing doesn't actually exist, parental alienation? And
Well,
there are cases where it's legitimate. Of course, if you're being like abused, and
absolutely.
people tend to stay with the abuser as well, which is also another interesting point. Is I'm curious to know a bit more about that, and I think it's based on a fear, but I wonder why there's resistance for this, or even in the court system, in Canada, they're
Yeah.
very resistant to even look at this.
Yeah. And I was just reading something about that. Let's see if I can find that because you're right. It was kind of identified in 1980s. I'm sure you know a little bit about that, like the man named Gardner, and he was the one that sort of coined the term parental alienation syndrome. But there wasn't enough evidence to actually make it like a DSM diagnosis, and there's quite a bit of dispute about that over the years. I just want to pull up that thing that I was reading about that. Why it's all these papers here, but
Oh, no,
uh,
I'm so impressed by all the research you've done on this.
yeah. No, I just love learning about this kind of thing. It's so important too because it affects so many people. I have one site here that actually has a list of like what all the symptoms are. So this person wrote a book and it's called Child and Family Behavior. She wrote her study is the parent alienation syndrome, and she uses like a family therapy collaborative systems approach. Her name is Linda Gottlieb, and she has
Hmm.
an MSW, over 40 years experience, and like this is what she specializes in working with families and parental alienation. And so like I said, the term was brought about in 1985 by Richard Gardner, and it's not recognized in the DSM-5, but it does show up a lot in working with attorneys and like family courts and like family therapy programs and that. And there is a lot of people out there that are working to get it more officially recognized. That this person has a lot to do with sort of fighting for that.
Yeah, because the
Yeah.
whole thing is, for many of us, me included, we don't
Mhm.
know what's happened until it's happened.
Yeah,
There's no
exactly.
like when I got married or divorced, there was no course there that said
Yeah.
beware of this. So what are some of those telltale signs? Like I'll give you a couple of examples that I should have picked up on and I never did. And one was
Yeah.
that my ex used to call me all the time and my son all the time, "Are you safe? Are you safe?" So there's
Yeah.
this message that comes through that your dad's not safe. Or whenever he was sick, she insisted he stayed at her house because she could take care of him. So these little things that happen over time, I didn't think anything of it. I just thought she's just doing what people do. Like you care about your kid, but it was chronic. It kept on happening. So what
Yeah.
are some signs that one could focus on early on? And I think that's what you were getting at as well with this article was what could people do, or what should you watch out for?
Some of the signs to identify parent alienation syndrome, like when I mean, these are just some of the signs that professionals would be looking for, but I
Mhm.
think it's kind of helpful because one of the big things is you want to listen closely to the language of a child. Because I did say, like, when a child is living with a primary parent, and if they are being alienated, they're going to start to feel uncomfortable with the discourse, right? They're going to start to feel uncomfortable. So looking very closely at the language of the child and kind of considering their choice of words, and whether they're age appropriate or not. Are they the
Mhm.
child's words or are they the parent's words? They would tell a professional, to look at, detailed medical and social and psychosocial history, and continuing to screen the child. They sort of suggest making sure that the child is going for regular visits where this type of screening is being done in any divorce, right? Just to
Yeah.
prevent this from
Mm.
happening. Inquire about the child's home status, and how things are at home, and using purposeful, empathetic, patient-centered, but in a child's perspective way, like questions to explore their ideas and experiences and concerns. Um, and how they relate to themselves and their family, inquiring about school and interests and things that might, looking for age appropriate, developmental appropriate answers. You know,
Mm,
when there's something off, it's usually it's more easy to see it as continuing to be screened.
okay.
And we definitely want to look at the child's behaviors, right? Independent of the parental behavior. So looking at any behavioral changes or any
Hmm.
signs of like anxiety or fear or withdrawal, or do they appear guarded or uncomfortable? You know, is there a change in their behavior from how you know your child to be? I mean, any separation is stressful for a child, so there will be expected changes, but as a parent, you would kind of be able to notice that there's something off about them, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And okay. Yeah, a lot of
yeah,
things are coming together for me for sure.
yeah,
Well, when we got a divorce, he was 4 years old. And then when he was
yeah,
13, that's when he said to me, I don't want to live with you anymore. We had 50-50 custody. And it was interesting, Shannon. It happened about 4 months after I was very open and honest with my ex-wife to stop calling him all the time and checking in on him because he
yeah,
was very dependent on her for
yeah,
meditating at night. And it was after that that I noticed major changes in him and major
yeah,
changes in her.
yeah,
And I don't know if that's the straw that broke the camel's back. Like if I could go
yeah.
turn back the hands of time, I don't think I'd have done that because I think she lost the control in that moment.
Mm,
Possibly. I don't know. In terms of one thing that I hear a lot of and one thing I've been curious about, like for me it's been 7 years, my son's almost 22. What
yeah,
are things that alienated parents could do to try to open up that door to reunification if, and be mindful of this, that you're blocked, like I'm blocked from social media. I don't know his email address. I don't know if he gets my letters. I'm not sure what
yeah,
he sees from me.
absolutely.
What can one do? And the second part of that question is, what are some
Yeah,
coping strategies? And as one patiently waits, like one thing that people have told me is, Glenn, just be patient. And of
yeah,
course, that's all I have, and I have hope as well. But what's your best advice in terms of with an adult child who was alienated at a young age? What can a parent do?
absolutely. I think the most important thing too is what you mentioned there is coping strategies, right? So getting emotional support, professional emotional support, right? Because friends and family, as much as they care, they may not be able to offer that objective sort of advice, right? Getting professional support by somebody that's, you know, not within that system that can help be a sounding board and be someone, you know, can provide psychoeducation and tools to cope, right? There's a lot of tools out there to support one individually through something like this. So getting that support early on, and also like I would encourage like you're doing like with the self help and reading and learning and educating oneself on the syndrome and these types of symptoms that can show up. And also what I read in the research is trying to have an empathetic approach to the parent
Hmm.
that's alienating. I know that seems like, wow, like why would someone do that? Like how can I empathize with this person's behavior? Like it's so hard, but I did read that is one of the ways early on, to not be so resistant towards it, but to empathize, like, wow, like why is this person feeling the need to alienate their child from the parent? Like what is happening for this person? Like, 'cause it's severe and it's not okay. And so like having an empathetic sort of approach does have a way of starting to relax those parts that are up in them,
Hmm.
and can sort of contribute to more quicker restructuring of the family, because it still is a dynamic, right, of the child and the primary care parent and then the other parent. It's still a bit of a family dynamic. So having empathy for what might be happening there can help relax some of those behaviors, those alienating behaviors, and perpetuate this restructuring. So there's getting professional help with how to do that would be, I would encourage that too. That's something that I found in the research that they're looking at.
Well, yeah, empathy and
Yeah.
compassion is a big one for sure because I get why
Yeah.
she's doing it, and that has led to me forgiving and also
Yeah.
dealing with my anger issues.
Yeah.
And I did
Yeah.
have one person who's a professional who knows the situation share with me that if she were to lose her son, she would lose everything.
Yeah.
That's the center of her universe, where I have my wife, I have my friends, I have my family, I have my stepson. He's all she has.
And if you think about it, Glenn, if she had that tremendous loss in
Yeah.
her early life where her father just up and that, I wonder what that would be like to think about losing her son because you
Yeah.
are you're the other parent, and what if he chose you, right? So she's doing everything
Mm,
she can to prevent that.
yeah.
That's her own work. That's where she needs to do her own work. Not that I know her or her situation, but
Hmm.
just my sort of clinical eye on it, that would be where I would, that's what sort of stands out to me. You know, he would appear to be the center of her world, which is a
Yeah.
lot to put on a child.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, all the evidence aligns with that
Yeah.
as well.
Hmm.
So, somebody in my shoes, where they've been alienated for a while, how does I think I hear boys, and I get this, I'm still not mature. Boys take a long time to mature.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
females tend to mature at the age of 18, 19, or 20.
Mhm.
When is the right time? Like I'm sending out letters, but I've done things I shouldn't have
Yeah.
done. Like I've said things I shouldn't have said, but it was done from trying to get attention, and I get my part in it as well because I feel
Yeah.
rejected, and sometimes that
Yeah.
comes across and triggers me in negative ways. But what can somebody do to open up that door to lead to some sort of reunification
Yeah.
before the person dies? Like one of my mother, she's 80, and she is so worried because she had such a close relationship with my son. They were almost best friends, and she's worried she will die without ever seeing him.
Yeah.
How does one knock on that door and get the child to try to open up a bit so they can actually see the light on the other side? Where right
Yeah.
now it's just darkness.
I hear you. I hear you. And there's always probably that part of you that's just like wants to try and try and try and doesn't lose hope. And just, I can imagine for a parent that's been alienated, like it's just a constant thinking about how can I connect? How can I, like there's just all this sort of ruminating about how can I fix this or how can I connect? And it never goes away. And I can't imagine what that would be like. I think, when I think about a child's development, the brain really is continuing to develop until a person is at least 25. For some, it's
Okay.
26, right? So there's still that development happening. And when someone moves into adulthood like that, they do need to kind of go down that road and experience life outside of that dynamic with that alienating parent, right? So when they move into like peer relationships and workplace relationships, and they start to see how other people live and how other families live, I find that happens a lot in my clinical experience. I see where people start to finally move away from some of these unhealthy situations, and they're like, wait a minute, and then they kind of show up for this professional help because like who am I and how do I navigate this? Like they kind of need to come to terms on their own, right? It's there's not much we can do to control that, or influence it. I know it's
Hmm.
it's hard here, but they kind of need to come to that on their own. As the alienated parent, I would suggest like continuing to just empathize with where they're at, and they may not want to be reached, and that's what's hard about this. I can imagine they just
Yeah.
it feel intrusive for them in a way. So I wonder, yeah, just continuing to empathize with them, getting that emotional support for oneself, and
Well, as I
reaching
was
out.
listening to one book about hardwiring happiness, one
Yeah,
thing they talk about in the book is to think about the positive times that I
yeah,
had with my son and to relive those moments. So when I go notice I'm going down one path and I say, "Hey, stop, Glenn.
yeah,
No, don't go down the,
yeah,
75% negative
yeah,
thoughts, which most of us do, and focus on going on a positive journey instead." Eventually, hopefully my son will come back to my life. And one thing I heard from the men's support group in Nanaimo was when your son does come back, that's when he's going to need you because he'll be wounded.
yeah.
When you reunify with a child, what is your best advice to the parent that was targeted?
Yeah. So, my best advice is to relax that part of the self that has been, hurt and wounded as the alienated parent, because I'm sure it was quite traumatic for the alienated parent too, right? For the way sometimes the child adopts the same behaviors as the parent that was doing the alienating. So they can be cruel, they can be mean, they can be hostile, they can develop it and they can believe it. So I can't imagine what this has been like for you or for other parents that are in that situation. But when the child does reach out and say that does happen and they do want to reunify, the best thing, my best sort of advice, not that I usually give people too much advice, I like to help them to explore what works for them, but is to be empathetic, and to use empathetic listening skills and practices. And I do coach people on how to do so, but there's lots of tools out there on how to just listen. It's not about talking about what you're feeling or giving advice or talking about your own experiences. It's about hearing the child and being there where they're at and just being a safe person for them to talk about and share. Maybe they just want to talk about the weather. Maybe they just want to talk about, what they had for lunch today, but it's just good listening, giving full attention, good eye contact, good, turning off all distractions and just being there in that space with the child and creating a good experience, because that will change the brain chemistry for that child. And even if they're an adult, maybe they're in their 20s, it starts to slowly change and shift things for them because they've had that one good experience and then we go back to that and it builds. Yeah, but my suggestion would be learning empathetic listening skills, and using those when reconnecting with the child.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And also taking a position of forgiveness and letting go
Yeah.
of the past, it would be
Yeah.
really important as an adult. And
Yeah.
yeah. Another question for you here is for the parent that's a target,
Yeah.
how do you not take on this victim mentality? Because it's hard. Like I notice sometimes I question myself, am I the narcissist? Am I the problem? Do I deserve this? How does one stay out of that so you don't fall into this victim mentality?
Yeah, I could see that for sure. And because in a way, that targeted parent was a victim, because they were a victim of the same abuse, right? That child might have been experiencing. So it's quite traumatic, um, for sure. And it would be hard to move away from that. But again, my advice would be to get into a situation where someone's getting, psychoeducation and professional help to help a person work through that, and to um, know that, they were a good parent and still are a good parent, and to focus on their strengths and, be compassionate, and that develop that compassionate sort of self talk, so that,
Hmm.
and having tools for that when we do notice that there's that thought system where we're getting on track with thinking of a victim, is to getting ourselves back on track of thinking, you know, that I am a good parent. I have done
Hmm.
a good job, and not owning that alienating parents' behaviors. Yeah.
Yeah, trying to be your best self. So when the child does come back to you, you're the stable one.
Yeah.
You're not emotionally out of control, even though for me,
Yeah.
it must have appeared that I was emotionally out of control at times, which I was for sure. I was like
Mm,
grasping at straws. What do I do?
absolutely.
Shannon, thanks for answering all those questions. And I'm curious to know if there's any last words that you want to share about alienation, or because you've done a lot of research. Is there anything
Mm.
that you feel is important for the audience to hear around alienation?
Um, yeah, I think it's important. I think it's absolutely important to, when parents might be at the onset of divorce or separation and there are children involved, I think it's important to want to include regular screenings for the child. If the child isn't going to be living with you, I think that's where we're kind of going. I think they're looking at training practitioners and doctors and psychologists in a way so that they know how to screen for this early on, because it does get overlooked and it is very severe, and there's evidence there that it does exist. It's unfortunate that it's not in the DSM-5, that diagnostic manual, but it's important to regularly screen a child and check on their well-being and you know get that emotional support for them and for oneself. You know,
And
yeah,
and and how do you think one can best advocate for this cause to because let me back up a bit.
yeah,
The so I've tried through the Prime Minister's office, through the Justice Counselor system, through the Ministry of the Attorney General. Like I've contacted everybody I think I can in Canada around this, and not really getting any response other than it's very complex and people generally don't go there. How do you think one can advocate to the government? Of what's your I don't expect you to have an answer to this, but what would be your best advice in terms of getting the family law system, like even in respect to
Yeah.
courses or like when you do get divorced, how can how can we get the attention out there that this actually does exist and we should pay attention to it because the numbers are increasing. It does have a huge mental health impact. It's a burden in our system where families are losing each other.
Yeah.
What do you think's needed? What do you think is maybe the missing piece here that would get the attention of the family law system to actually focus in on this?
You know, and there is quite a bit of conflict there because there is some studies that I read. I talked earlier in our interview here about the discourse in the legal community around divorce. And so that's kind of where I feel that it's really stuck because using a child's words and experiences, it doesn't support, the legal community. So it just gets displaced. And that's where I think a lot of this is a child's voice does need to be heard in these situations. I think advocating in a way like where I've talked about, in primary care settings, like I think that this does need to become regular screening. Like I think it's important that people are aware that, children are in these situations and, when there's a divorce happening, I think it needs to be regular screening that the child is, going and there's, PAS sort of symptoms being checked upon, because it can be caught when this
Hmm.
is happening. And I read that in the research. So I think, increasing awareness of PAS in primary care can serve, to identify children who meet the criteria for it and decrease the prevalence of it for, I think that can be a huge part of this. But definitely there's a lot more work in advocating that needs to be done in the legal community. Like I totally agree. It's a child's voice is not getting heard in these situations. And I think that's a lot of the problem. Yeah.
Shannon, thank you for your time, for your care, your energy. You're a gift to this world. You're a gift. And I think everybody who knows you knows that. And you're a gift to me for sharing this with me today and answering these questions and going through this because so many of us just are lost, confused, don't know what to do. If somebody feels lost and confused, is there a way people can reach out to you?
I do have like a website and an email. So my email is just my first name, Shannon Elgert dot psychotherapy at gmail.com. So people can reach out to me and inquire by email. And then if they were to look me up on psychologytoday.com, I have a profile on there and a link to my website where people can take a look at what I do and the services that I offer and find out a little bit more about what psychotherapy is. And then there's a link to my booking page if people were interested. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I'll put that all in the show notes so people have access to that.
Okay.
Shannon, thanks so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time and again, your passion, your advice. All the best in your journey and your growth in getting your PhD and
Yeah.
so impressive and just all the work you're doing and how you're building stronger communities where you live right now. That's so important.
Well, thanks so much, Glenn. Thanks so much for having me. It was an honor to be here today discussing this with you. And I think it's important to bring awareness on this. And I was really happy to be here to
Thank
connect
you. And
with
the
you.
honor is all mine, Shannon.
Thank you.
Thanks to our listeners. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.